Hey guys, how is it going? It's Dmitry here, and today I'm going to discuss about another topic. I'm going to discuss about so-called async await, and still it's going to be more or less related to promises too, because I'm going to discuss about how this async await works together with promises, and I will explain in details what's async await and how it works together with promises. But first of all, guys, I would like to start from apologies. I made a mistake in a previous tutorial when I started discussing about promises, and the mistake itself, it's a bit misleading, right? So I'm not sure, guys, if you remember, but I said a couple of times that over here, when we execute this logic and when we call in resolve, finally, in result, it's going to be passed unresolved promise, right? I guess I mentioned a couple times that it's still going to be, the promise going to be pending, right? But the reality is, as soon as you resolve promise here, or you call in resolve functionality, then the promise going to be resolved, right? So obviously here we already returning resolved promise. And to prove it, guys, I will show you that that's the case. For example, guys, here I'm going to return a resolved promise now. Let's run it. Guys, you can see here, right? So I'm trying to log out this result, which is obviously a promise, right? So, and you can see here promise 11. So it's resolved promise and it's carrying the actual resolved value, right? So essentially resolution process happened when we call in this resolve function. But guys, to prove that that the actual moment when the resolution happens, and before that the actual promise is still in the pending state, if you just comment that out and if I run it, you can see, guys, right? Instead of resolved promise, we're returning pending. So we're still returning promise, but it's in the status pending because we didn't resolve this promise. So guys, that's how it is. And obviously here, why we call in the then function? We call in then function in order to extract actual value or return value from return promise. So you can see here once again, right? We return in promise, and inside of promise we have this value, but we still need to extract this value, right? Because we don't need promise anymore, promise part. So in order to do that, you have to call then in this case. Hope, guys, it makes sense, and hope once again, guys, sorry for that, and yeah, I definitely made a mistake, guys. So let's move on, guys. Now I would like to discuss about another functionality, and it's called async await. And guys, I'm just going to copy and paste prepared code because otherwise this tutorial is going to be really long. So this is the code, right? And what I'm going to do now, and yeah, let's go step by step what happens here. So we have this test function, I just call it test, right? We call in this test function, and inside of this function we also call in another function, right? A function, we call it return promise. And here, guys, it's basically a logic. I just wrapped the logic from previous tutorial, and you can see it's still we creating a promise, right? And then we resolving promise, or otherwise rejecting promise. Guys, I would like to show how, like, what we're receiving now if we run, what kind of result we're getting if we run it. So we're returning promise, right? So here promise 11, right? And result is 11. So obviously it's the same as in case of previous tutorial. So guys, now do you remember, guys, before we use, in order to get the actual value, we use then function, right? and then we kind of chain it, and finally we got the result, right? And guys, it's another way how to perform it, and I will show you guys. If I specify this function as an async function, and the way you going to specify it is async function, or define it as async function, you have to specify this keyword async before function, and then as soon as you specify this function as async, or define it as a sync function, you can use this keyword await here. So guys, when you define this keyword here, this keyword await, what it says, or what is indicating that we're going to wait while we executing this function, right? We're going to wait for this line to be finalized in order to move on to the next line, right? So guys, the rest of the function, right? The rest of the functionality. What would happen here? Guys, another important thing to understand: if you specify this way, when you specify await, async await, you don't need then function anymore, right? So what I would say is, now we're still returning a resolved promise, for instance, but then because we specify this async await, we kind of wrapping this promise or resolved promise inside of another promise, and the final result going to be, as soon as we receiving this resolved promise, this promise that wrapping the actual resolved promise, right, going to give us the actual result, right? So obviously, again, the most important thing to understand: as soon as you specify await, you don't need then. We're returning resolved promise, and if you specify await and async, then you're just going to extract the actual result from the resolved promise. And guys, to prove it, I'm going to run it now. Here we go, guys. We got the actual result, right? Pretty cool stuff, guys. So yeah, and again, now we don't need this then, which is, I think it's a neat way to do stuff, but it's still, there are some pros and cons, right, guys? For instance, if you know that you would like to wait for this piece of line of code, right, in order to be executed or finalized, if you're okay with that, then it's fine, right? Otherwise, I still would recommend you just use promise with then, right? But again, another important thing to understand: when you use await, it's resolving, you getting the actual result of the promise, of resolved promise, not the actual promise. So guys, yeah, that's pretty much that I wanted to cover in this tutorial, and hopefully, guys, it's clear for you what happens here. And let me know if you have any questions. And yeah, please guys, subscribe, please guys, like this tutorial if you like it, and yeah, follow me, guys. Thank you very much, guys, and goodbye.